So last night, the state of Oklahoma resoundingly rejected a ballot question that would have legalized the use of recreational marijuana in the state. Now, this is pretty interesting because while many expected this ballot measure to fail, it's quite surprising how resoundingly the failure was. Every single county in the entire state of Oklahoma voted against legal marijuana. Even Oklahoma City, which has been a county that has almost flipped to the Democrats in the past couple of election cycles. And obviously, with an issue like legal weed, you would expect a more liberal urban center like Oklahoma County, at least compared to the rest of the state, to be supportive of it. And ultimately, that wasn't the case. So we're going to talk about this ballot measure and really marijuana legalization in the country as a whole, because I think it's a much more complicated question than some of the polls will have us believe. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So anyway, as I mentioned, legal weed in the state of Oklahoma failed by about 23 points or so. Again, some of the votes I think are still sort of rolling in as I'm recording this. Last time this was updated was 11 p.m. Obviously, by the time you guys are seeing this video, there's probably going to be more of the vote in. But so far, every single county in the entire state of Oklahoma rejected this measure. Now, an interesting fact about this ballot measure, this was the largest defeat for legal marijuana since the beginning of legalization efforts back in 2012, starting with Colorado. So this is the most resounding rejection of this in any state in the country thus far. And really the question is, why would that be the case? Now, if we take a look at marijuana legalization polling throughout the country, again, some of the polls are a little bit outdated. This is from fall of 2021. 68% of Americans allegedly supported it. Now, one of the things I've noticed about marijuana legalization and gun rights is that normally when it comes to polling, there's a discrepancy between the polls that a lot of people are given and actual votes. Gun control is much more popular in polling than it is in actual elections. We've seen some very blue states, like Maine, for instance, back in 2016, oppose certain gun control measures. Oregon did this back in 2022, or at least narrowly supported a gun control measure. It was almost a 50-50 vote in a state that is pretty democratic overall. So I think marijuana, like gun rights, is one of those issues where the polling doesn't always line up with how people end up actually voting. And as I mentioned, this was the largest defeat for the pro-marijuana campaign since these sorts of questions have been put on the ballot. Now, what I think is also interesting about this ballot measure in general is that the Yes campaign had much more money and resources than the No campaign. Though it had less endorsements, you had a lot more money thrown behind it. You had civil liberties organizations, the ACLU and other groups coming out in favor of this, criminal justice organizations. But if we take a look at the No campaign, it was virtually a bunch of statewide officials, the Sheriff's Association, the Southern Baptist Associations, the medical associations, a bunch of groups. Even the Oklahoma Farm Bureau came out against this measure. And ultimately, these groups, even though they had less money and reach, resonated more with the people of Oklahoma. Now, Arkansas was another state that defeated marijuana legalization back in November. It was by a more narrow margin, 56-43, but nonetheless, it's a pretty resounding defeat. And, you know, there's a similar pattern between these sort of ballot measure maps and, of course, the generic political maps we see in general elections between Republicans and Democrats. Obviously, the more urban liberal centers, places like Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and again, I'm saying that relative to the rest of Oklahoma, they tend to be much more friendly towards these positions than the more rural areas, especially in the western part of Oklahoma, which also happens to be the reddest part of Oklahoma when you actually look at the breakdown between Republicans and Democrats. And the same thing holds true in Arkansas and other states where these ballot measures have been put forth. Now, I think another factor that needs to be considered is the overall culture of these states. Arkansas and Oklahoma are both southern states, and they're also very religious states compared to other places where marijuana has been legalized. Massachusetts, for instance, back in 2016, voted to legalize 53-46. Now, an interesting thing about this, again, this was a state that voted for Hillary Clinton by nearly 30 points back in 2016, and yet marijuana legalization only won by about 7. So again, there's a huge discrepancy. Again, you're going to have some Democrats voting against it. You certainly saw that in Massachusetts, especially in more wealthy localities around Cape Cod and the Boston suburbs. and you saw basically the rest of the state come out in favor of it. So again, there are some ideological differences. Obviously, marijuana is not a Democrat or Republican issue, so to speak. Obviously, Democrats are much more in favor of it than Republicans, but when it actually comes to a vote, you're going to have some Republicans voting in favor of it, and you're going to have some Democrats voting against it. But again, this is an issue that's sort of been creeping its way throughout states over the past 10 years. A lot of states have been voting on whether it's medical marijuana or just marijuana in general. The states that have legalized it: Colorado, New York, New Jersey, California, Massachusetts. Those are sort of the testing grounds, so to speak, of these sort of proposals. And obviously Oklahoma was one of the states that ended up rejecting that. Technically, marijuana is illegal at the federal level. So really, if the federal government wanted to, they could essentially override all of these states. Arizona we didn't talk about, but they could essentially override all of these states that have voted to legalize it and start enforcing federal law again. Because while marijuana is legal on the state level, it's technically still not legal at the federal level. And, the attorney general theoretically could go after these states if they wanted to. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened during the Obama administration. Hasn't really happened in the Trump administration either. Obviously, in the Biden administration, it's not expected to happen. We'll see what happens during the next administration. But so far, this seems to be a rolling tide, mostly in legalization's favor. Again, most states in the country have either legal medical or recreational use. It's very rare that you have states that have banned it outright. I think there's only 3 states that have banned it for both medical and recreational use. I think Idaho and Nebraska are 2. There's another one thrown in there, I think somewhere in the Great Plains. But regardless, this is sort of an issue that, while it supposedly on paper is very popular with the American electorate, ultimately when it actually comes to a vote, opinions are much more nuanced. And I think it really depends how you word the question and ultimately what the ballot measures actually entail. I think the Oklahoma measure in particular had a lot of regulations attached to it. South Dakota had voted to legalize it, I think, I forget what year, and then sort of rescinded that a couple of years later through another ballot measure once the South Dakota Supreme Court ruled it against its constitution. It had to go to a vote again. So, states are sort of all over the place with this. Again, it seems like the trend is in favor of legalization, but you do have instances like Oklahoma, like Arkansas, where they're sort of going against the grain and saying that this isn't something they want, particularly in these states. Now, again, going forward in terms of federal legislation, there really hasn't been any meaningful federal legislation one way or the other. There probably won't be. I think this will probably remain a state issue for the foreseeable future. That's the way it's been going. I think most people in favor of marijuana legalization are just hoping that eventually over time more and more states will legalize it until it's effectively legal in all 50 states. But like I said, it does slightly conflict with the federal government. But, this, I will say, was a very low turnout election. You only had about 566,000 people voting. Just to compare that to 2020, for instance, you had over 1.5 million people voting. So, a third of general election turnout. Now, that's not really surprising given the fact that this ballot measure was put in March. It obviously was put there for a reason. The people that put this up to a vote sort of determined that it would be more likely to fail if it was on a non-election day somewhere in March when, most people aren't really considering voting. Again, this isn't even a partisan issue. It's about one particular topic that whether you feel strongly for or against, you would really come out and vote. Nobody else was really voting in this election, and thus that's why you had such low turnout. But obviously this was by design. But we'll ultimately see what other states decide to vote for or against marijuana in the future. I know there's certain referendums in 2023 and 2024, as are abortion referendums, which is another topic I probably want to go in at some point in a future video, because throughout the rest of this year and into next year, there's going to be a number of abortion referendums as well. And it is sort of interesting to see the difference between these ballot measures and the general election results, because as I said, these are two topics, marijuana and abortion, where there is crossover voting. You have some Democrats, a very small portion, but some Democrats who vote against legal weed and vote against abortion. And then on the contrary, you've got Republicans that vote in favor of legal weed and vote in favor of abortion access. So we'll ultimately see. This was a pretty interesting result out of Oklahoma, pretty historic. Again, it's the largest rejection of legal marijuana in any state in the country. We'll ultimately see where marijuana policy goes in the coming years as we get more and more of these ballot referendums. Anyway, that's all for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.